during this talk today, I will try to convince you that you don't need a PhD to do data science. Hopefully. All right, so I'll be talking about exploring Stack Overflow. So first, a little disclaimer, I'm in no way related to Stack Overflow. And as was mentioned, I am related to Cambridge University, which is a very nice place, very beautiful, but I work here. So let's not talk about that. I work in biomedical research. I help biologists research cancer. And they always come with their data, and then we analyze that, etc., which sounds very good and very motivating. But in a way, like when I look at the data that I analyze each day, they look more like this. It's not very interpretable. I work on the level of genes and DNA, etc. And this is basically just A, T, C, and G, and that's all. And when a biologist comes and says, OK, this gene does that, and OK, oh, you got this gene out of your analysis, I'm like, OK, if you say so. So, in my free time, I like to play with more interesting data sets. Like, for example, I did social analysis of Star Wars networks, which was a lot of fun. I was very excited because this month it got published in Pour la Science, which is like a French edition of Scientific American, like a pop science magazine. But then I actually read the magazine, and it says Oxford. So let's never mention this again, and let's go into Stack Overflow. So I decided to analyze Stack Overflow, and why? Well, we all use Stack Overflow. We all do this, right? So in a way, in our daily work, we all come into contact with Stack Overflow in some way. And Stack Overflow gives a lot of the data available to us to download and play with. And first way how to get the data from Stack Overflow is to just use their API, which gives you all the information that you can get from Stack Overflow. But it's not the best way to download all the data from an API. So the good thing about Stack Overflow is that they give the whole dump of entire Stack Overflow available, and they publish it every roughly 3 months. So I apologize, the data that I'll be showing you will be already 4 months old. But it's amazing. You can just download the entire dump of all the data on Stack Overflow and then play with it. So this is when I downloaded it. And you can see the sizes of the files here. And it's roughly 135 gigabytes altogether. Who thinks this is big data? Couple of people? Well, it doesn't fit into RAM on my laptop, but it does fit into RAM on my desktop. So I wouldn't say this is big data. I can just load it and work with it in the same way that I would work with something much smaller. So this is good. I was quite surprised that it's not a gigantic data set. And if this is zipped, it's already just 30 gigabytes. So you can download it as well and play with it. So now what? I got the data. I got 135 gigabytes of data. So what can I do with it? And this actually happens, I'm asking this question quite a lot at work, because sometimes a colleague comes and says, OK, here are 4 terabyte hard drives with data. And I'm like, what do I do with that? What do you want me to do with the data? And well, the data will tell you, right? You just look at the data and you will know what's interesting there. Well, it doesn't work like that. If you are doing any data science, or if you are collaborating with data scientists, ask questions. Because if you don't have questions, data won't help you. You can have gigantic data sets, but if you don't ask the right questions, it won't tell you anything. So I decided to ask my first question. Well, if you look at some questions on data, on Stack Overflow, this is actually the first ever question 8 years ago. And it's asking about form opacity. And the nice thing is that all the questions on Stack Overflow are tagged. So they immediately tell you what are the questions about. And that's amazing from a data science point of view. So the first question you might be thinking about, so what's the most common tag, right? That's the most obvious question. But this is not an interesting question, because you can get the data directly from StackOverflow. And the most common tag is JavaScript, second is Java, third is C#, and the fourth is PHP. All right, we got that. So what can we ask next? Well, I was looking at the questions, and I realized that apart from the tag, they also give me a time when the question was asked. So I can look at when are people asking these questions. Because then if I'm, for example, I do things with F#, and if I want to ask something about F#, I will know then when people are actually active from the F# community on Stack Overflow. And the same things for other communities. So we can look at when are people asking questions. So this is my first question. And because it's kind of cumbersome to be playing with like 100 gigabyte files, I already pre-processed the file a bit. And I'll be showing you some bits of F# that really help processing files and data. And that helped me being more productive. Because when I heard the topic of this conference was about shipping stuff, I was like, I'm in academia, we don't ship stuff. Well, we might be shipping papers, but that takes months. So talk about continuous delivery. Anyway, back to F#. And I really like one feature of F#, which is called type providers, that allow you access any data in a very nice way. They basically make data part of your IDE. So I have a CSV file with some preprocessed data, and you'll have to believe me when I say it has about 1 gigabyte. So it already takes some time to even load it into memory. But I can use type providers to help me play with that. So I will just create a type. And the data file, I think I have it open here. It's actually just a CSV file containing like a date, day of the week, and a tag. So I will create a type provider for that. Let's call it tag time. And because it's a CSV file, I will use the CSV provider. Let's just copy over the location of the file. That's it. And now I can do let tt equal tag time get sample, which gives me the file. It gives me access to the file. And what it does in the background, it's looking at the beginning of the file, parsing it, and realizing what are the types of the elements in the file and what's the structure of the entire file. So now I can do tt.rows. And F# is a functional language, so I'll be using a lot of maps. So I can do now function tt dot. And now I know that in the file there is a day of a week, there is a tag, and there is a time. And also I know that time has the type system.datetime, which is amazing. I don't have to load this gigantic file. It might have not 1 gigabyte, it might have 20 gigabytes. But I can access all the things, write all my program this way, have all the type safety and everything, and then just run it on the file, and I will know that it will run correctly, which is amazing. And it really helps working with large data as well. So I won't even run it. Why? I don't need it. It's type safe. So I did this, and I'll show you some results. So this is, for example, F#. Show how many questions with the tag F# are asked based on different days. And you can see that it's more common on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. This is the weekday. And then it drops over Saturday and Sunday, because people are not at work, they are spending time with their families. That kind of makes sense, right? Then I looked at C#, and it looks very similar. But then I realized, well, if you look at it, the ratio between the weekday and weekend is getting like smaller and larger. Oh, sorry. Do you see that? And then I realized, OK, so people are asking more F# questions over the weekend. So what does it mean? Well, it means that people like to play with that in their free time more than they like playing with C#. So this is my friend, Chris, who's actually author of the VS Code plugin that I'm using for F#. And this is him in his free time coding on open source things in F#. So I decided to formalize this a little. So if we do a little graph, like Monday, Tuesday, etc., versus how many questions are asked. So the things that people use at work, they'll be asked on Monday to Friday, most of the time. We will omit the people who are unlucky enough to be working on weekends. And then there will be evening projects that people work in their free time, but sort of when they get some time. So that will be equally distributed roughly over the weekdays and over the weekends. And then there is the weekend time. Sometimes people have a lot of time. Sometimes they have more time if they want to dedicate some more time to something. Sometimes they spend little time. So I would like to propose a measure that if the time that people spend on weekends asking questions about certain technology is sort of a measure of how they like the technology or how they are willing to spend their free time learning that technology. And that can be either a small proportion if they don't like it very much, or it can be a large proportion if they like it more. So in this case, it will be larger than 1 if people spend even more time on weekends than they would spend on weekdays. Or it can be smaller than 1 if they don't really like the technology. So this is my weekend index. So how does it look, actually? Well, the sort of proof of concept. The most weekends are Minecraft, LWJGL, which is lightweight Java game library, SFML, D, and Pygame. So mostly people on weekends like to write games. That kind of makes sense. So what's the most weekday, the things that people won't do over the weekends? Scientifically proven. All right, but it sort of correlates with what we would think about the technologies, right? I don't see myself on the weekends when I'm in my sofa writing something to be looking at SQL Server reporting services, 2008. And then I decided to compare, let's say, the 8 most common tags on StackOverflow, and from them the most weekday is C#, Origin, and surprisingly PHP and Python. Well, Python, I'm not surprised. I'm surprised by PHP that it's relatively common on weekends, but it's still only about 60% the level on weekends compared to weekdays. So all these are technologies that people don't really use that much over the weekend. And then I decided to plot some functional or mostly functional languages. And the most weekend one is Elm, which has an index larger than 1. So Elm right now seems to be a very popular hobby language. So that kind of makes sense as well. Erlang is kind of mostly weekday. F# is sort of in the middle. So sometimes people say, oh, F#, everyone uses that for their hobby projects, who would use it at work? Actually, the data says that people use it at work a lot. More than Haskell, definitely. Haskell is everyone's hobby language. So I will put this data online, hopefully soon, so that you can look up your favorite technology and see if people like it over the weekends or not. So then I was looking at some other things, and one thing that struck my attention was the difference between Jenkins and Travis. This is actually a question from StackOverflow. It was closed because it's opinion-based. But both are continuous integration systems, and people are constantly saying, oh, OK, so which one should I use? There is actually quite a big difference between them. If you look at this, well, Travis has 0.6 roughly index, and Jenkins has 0.2, which means people use Travis much more over the weekends than they would use Jenkins. And it kind of makes sense, because Travis allows free hosting for open source projects, and This way, it's much easier to just fire it up on your own hobby project compared to Jenkins, which you have to host yourself. So this already gives you something think about who you are designing things for. If you want people to use things in their free time, make it as easy as possible for them. If not, well, people might use it at work, but they won't be spending their free time enjoying your product. So what else can we do with Stack Overflow data? Well, then I was looking at some of the profiles, and I realized that they also ask people for location, which is kind of nice. I was a bit skeptical because, who puts their true location on Stack Overflow? But yeah, here is the location. So I decided to ask, well, where are actually people that post on Stack Overflow? Let's see if people actually post their true location, and where are they? If I want to find more F# programmers, which country should I move into? If I want to find more R programmers, which country should I go to? And if I assume that people posting and answering questions on Stack Overflow are roughly similarly distributed across all countries, then this should give me quite a lot of information. So in total, in the data set that I was analyzing, as I said, it's 4 months old, but there are over 5 million users, and 769,000 filled in their location. So that's quite a lot, actually. It's definitely more than 1%. So that's good. I can get quite a lot of information out of this. It's almost 1 million people telling me where they are. Well, some of the locations were not so reliable. But some other people put in their true location, and I tried to match the things that people put on Stack Overflow into the location field with countries in the world, and 83% of them matched. So that's quite a lot. I already knew location of 83% of the people. Well, then I looked at the actual locations. Well, some of them were listing them, unfortunately, Germany. Well, still Germany it is. So that was easy to match. Other people put in their location up to their office number. I was quite puzzled by that. I'm not sure if those people know that the data are available to anyone to look at. Or maybe they think that people will come and knock on their door and say, "Thank you for the answer." That was amazing. Some other people put in their full location like this, up to their house number, but I don't think anyone is going there to knock on their door. I had to look this up, and this place actually looks like this. So people are on Stack Overflow across the whole world, and that's amazing. So what I tried to do was, first I matched people to the locations that are countries in the world, and for the rest I had still about 100,000 locations that I couldn't identify that easily. So I decided to look at various location services online, and I tried to use Bing search because they give you, I think, 250,000 requests for free. So that's perfect for hobby projects. And did I mention type providers? Because I don't want to really write anything, and I can use type providers to query REST services. So this is an example request for Bing location services. And what I can do with type providers, I can just create another type, let's say Bing location. And this time, it's not going to be a CSV type provider, but this service returns a JSON. So I will use a JSON type provider. And again, I will just give it that sample. And that's basically all I need. Because right now, if I want to see where some place is located, I'll just create a little function, let locate, some query string, and I will just do Bing location, load, and I will give it a new request. let's just copy it over. I'm originally from Prague, so here was Prague as the example request, so I'll just change it to the query string. Close it. OK, and that's basically all I need. And the way I access this, well, let's actually change it a bit. Result. So this will be the result of the query. And it returns a JSON, so I can do result dot again. And now it gives me all the elements in the JSON file without even having to call it explicitly. So I remember that the address is in resource sets. So I will go through the individual resources. And in the resources, this is another JSON element, and it's in the resources. It's an awful format. OK, r.r, again, address. Finally, we found the address. And I will return the country, because I'm just interested in the country. And I'll change this. OK, so now I have a function that takes a string and returns an array of strings, because it will return the most likely countries where that place is located. So are we going to try to find Malmö? Now I will just evaluate it in F# interactive. And this is the first time that I'm actually running anything right now. I could write this whole function without actually caring about, is it going to return really the thing that I'm expecting? So locate Malmö. And the most likely one is in Sweden. Yes. The second most likely one is in the United States. The third one is in the United States again, and the fourth one is in Sweden. Is there another Malmö in Sweden? That sounds a bit strange. Well, at least the first location is correct. So I used this to locate all the remaining places that I couldn't locate directly. And now what I can do is just visualize that. So for example, most JavaScript programmers are in the US, where there are roughly 50,000 JavaScript programmers registered on StackOverflow. All right, but that kind of makes sense, because in the US, there is a lot of programmers overall. So it makes sense there will be a lot of JavaScript programmers. So I decided to put in a little equation. And what I will get out of this equation is number of programmers per million inhabitants. This is almost a legit unit. So here, n will be the total number, the number of people with certain location or registered on StackOverflow, divided by total population of a country, and then actually n is people registered answering a certain tag or questioning a certain tag, and then just scaling it based on the number of people on StackOverflow that are registered and that could be located. Complicated. So where are really programmers? Because programmers per million will tell me, if there are, if I go to a programming conference in that country, do I have higher likelihood of meeting people using my technology or smaller likelihood? And that's much more informative than the actual raw number of programmers. So where are people really? And for that, I need the number of people in that country. Well, did I mention type providers? There are type providers for all the types of data. So I can, for example, go to Wikipedia and download the numbers of people in each country from a Wikipedia page. It's HTML. There is an HTML type provider. So type wiki. And don't go to that web page and try to change it right now when I'm writing this, because I have a stable URL. So let's use the HTML provider. I will give it the stable URL. And now if I do, let's just bind it into W variable, get sample. And now if I do W dot, it will tell me, do I want to look at the HTML code, or do I want to look at lists on that web page, or do I want to look at tables? And I know that I want data from a table, so I'll just do w.tables. And that gives me all the tables that are on that website. So I can just look at countries and dependencies by population, and that's basically it. Now I can look at rows, and do seek.map, fun row. Yeah, in F#, fun is a keyword. Row dot, and it's loading. And now I know that for each row, I have several columns. One of them is % of world population, then a country, date, population, rank, source, etc. So I can look at countries, and I can look at, let's say, % of world population. And if I actually evaluate this, it should tell me, yeah, it returned a sequence, which is a lazy structure. OK, and now it returns pairs of countries and their % of population. And all this in basically like less than 10 lines of code. So I think this is pretty amazing. So right now I have the number of people registered on StackOverflow, people like answering certain tags, how many people in each country are there in total, etc. So we can put it together with the equation that I was showing you. And I have some things pre-computed here. So we'll just evaluate this. This might take a little while, a few seconds, because it's loading all the data into memory. And I decided, well, how shall I test it if it's actually giving me some reasonable answers? And I decided to see, like, for example, what will it give me for Erlang? So I would expect that most people writing Erlang will be actually in Sweden. So let's look at it. And here I have a GeoChart. And actually, most people are in Sweden and in China. I don't know if there are people in China writing Erlang, but actually, it gives me that in Sweden, on average, there should be around 72 programmers per million writing Erlang. Nice. So what language do you want to see? Well, F# I have in my slides. Let's look at JavaScript. So, JavaScript. Surprisingly, Iceland. On average, 3,000 JavaScript programmers per million. I think that's an outlier. In Sweden, 1,830 JavaScript programmers per million inhabitants. Do you think that's likely? I don't know. It's used a lot in China, apparently, as well. So, I'll go back into my slides. So this is how it looks for F#. And F# seems to be very popular in Scandinavia. And in Sweden, there are approximately 54 F# programmers per million. Nice. Well, there are more in Denmark, so just across the sea. So now I know where to meet programmers. And I was also looking at outliers in this measure. And there was one outlier that jumped up quite often. And that was actually Dominican Republic. And I suspect this might be like digital nomads who sit on a beach and then answer Stack Overflow questions. So if you want to find programmers from any technology, you can go to Dominican Republic, and there will be probably more than you would expect on average. So I looked at tags, I looked at users. What can we do next? Well, tags and users together define sort of communities. Because if some people are answering certain questions tagged with certain words, that means they are working with that probably. And if you have like a community of F# programmers, they won't be answering, what wouldn't F# programmers do? Well, they might be less likely to answer some Android questions, let's say. So tags, in a way, define relations between users. And if groups of users answer the same tags, then they form a community. And we can formalize that in sort of a form of a matrix. This is, again, me and my friend Chris. And we both do F#. I don't do C#. We both do JavaScript, because everyone does JavaScript. I do R, he doesn't do R, and neither of us does COBOL. And this I can do for all the users on StackOverflow and all the tags. And this will give me a large matrix of ones and zeros. And once I have a matrix, I'm a happy data scientist. I can do anything. So altogether, as I said, there are over 5 million users and about 44,000 tags. And this is kind of large to analyze on a laptop. This I was doing on a laptop. So I decided to just make the data set a bit smaller. So I looked at only power users that have more than 1,000 posts, meaning questions and answers, and tags that have more than 5,000 posts. So this reduced the data set to only a matrix of 1,600 times 800, which is already quite manageable. And then I decided, well, once you have, don't die on me. Once you have some kind of data like this, the first step is to visualize that. But how do you visualize something this large? Well, I decided to use my favorite method for visualizing large data sets, which is called t-SNE. And it's T-distributed stochastic neighborhood embedding. That's kind of a mouthful. Well, I will try to explain at least the idea, because that's really nice to appreciate how such a method works. I'm not going into any mathematics. But the key word is embedding. It's basically embedding this very large dimensional space, because I have 800 tags times 1,600 users. And I want to, in this case, visualize tags. So I have to embed 1,600 dimensional space into 2D so that I can visualize that. And that's called embedding. So imagine in a very large dimensional space, I have some sort of subspace where my data are concentrated. And if I look at these 2 points, they are kind of close together in the high dimensional space. But if you look at the logic of the data, they are kind of far from each other. So it's non-trivial to reduce this kind of situation into something visualizable in 2D. So what t-SNE does, it looks at the local neighborhood of each point. That means the things that are closest into 1,600 dimensional space. And it ignores the larger distances above certain threshold. So it will try to embed the small neighborhood of each point so that things that are close together in the high dimensional space will be close together in the low dimensional space as well. But on the other hand, things that are further from each other in the high dimensional space, they can be close, far, anything in the low dimensional projection, because it's simplifying it greatly. How do you compute that? It's kind of complicated, so I can just use some library. For example, in R, you just load a library called t-SNE, and then run a function called t-SNE. But I'm using F# and type providers. So I can use the R provider, which is type provider for R functions in F#. So the way how I call this from F# is just I open the R provider namespace and then just call r.t-SNE. And that's it. I'm not showing you because it takes some time to compute everything. So I can run it in R. Wonderful. This is the result. R is great for quickly trying things out, but sometimes you just need a proper programming language. So, yeah, the best thing about R is that it was written by statisticians. The worst thing about R is that it was written by statisticians. So I decided to go into JavaScript, but I'm using F#, right? So we have Fable, which is nice compiler from F# into JavaScript. Wonderful. So, and once I'm writing things in some normal programming language, I can, for example, avoid this kind of situation by optimizing positions of labels so that they don't overlap. So this is like a high-level overview of how it looked afterwards, and we can look at like individual little clusters in that space. So this is a little cluster of people doing Android. This is another cluster of people doing JavaScript and Node.js, etc. So just from how people interact with tags on Stack Overflow, it's able to get quite a lot about the structure of how these technologies relate to each other, which I think is amazing. This is another little cluster of people being confused about object-oriented programming and performance for some reason. I have things, sorry. I have one form of the visualization running here, and because this is in JavaScript, I can actually hover my mouse over things and it will tell me what it is. This is statistics. Ooh. And I can, for example, look at F#, and it tells me, okay, F# is here. What's around F#? Mono. I'm running this on Mono, by the way, so they are very much related. So I hope I'll put this online somewhere as well very soon. So it could tell me what are the communities, how do people actually interact with things on Stack Overflow. And this might seem like a sort of like, oh, it's fun. But this is actually used even in my normal work, because this is an example from an academic paper. That's why it doesn't look as nice. And this is like a visualization of human diversity, because people differ in certain locations in the genome, and you can then visualize how they differ with t-SNE, let's say, and this tells me, okay, so for example, this is a little cluster of Chinese from China and from US. And it's sort of a little separated because they intermix with other communities, but it's clustered together. So it can get quite a lot of information out of that quite easily. So this is a very useful visualization technique. So I looked at tags, I looked at users, I looked at technologies. Well, I haven't looked at questions and answers yet at all. Well, I decided to do something a bit more fancy. I was doing the embedding before from like tag vectors. Now I decided to use some neural networks. So not deep neural networks, just shallow neural networks, and I decided to use a method called word2vec, which is a very fancy name, but it's also just a form of embedding. And this is, instead of like embedding vectors, this is embedding words. So before, the t-SNE was just looking at points and their local neighborhood and embedding them into a 2D space. What word2vec does, it looks at words and their local context. That means words that are around each word. And it does embedding into a vector space that I can then like visualize and play with a bit more. And this is a very exciting technique. As an example, if I have two sentences, like F# is a functional language on the .NET, and Scala is a functional object-oriented language on JVM. So these two sentences are very similar. That means F# and Java are surrounded by similar words. But instead of .NET, there is JVM, etc. So this gives me quite a lot of information about the context of each word. But both are functional in a way. And once you run something like word2vec on questions and answers on Stack Overflow, you have the embedding into a vector space, and then you can do arithmetics in that vector space. So for example, you can do Scala minus JVM plus .NET. Any guesses what will be the result? It's not JavaScript. It's C# and F#, which is amazing, because just by not understanding what the words actually mean, just by looking at neighborhoods of each word and embedding that into a vector space, it could figure out that the equivalent of Java in .NET is C# and F# together, basically. And then I tried to do things like F# minus .NET. Any guesses? It's actually SML, standard ML, and OCaml. These are the two top hits, which is amazing. These are all languages from the same family. So I have no idea how it managed to infer this, but I think it's pretty amazing. So embeddings are fun. I hope you think so. And this is also used even in biomedical research, because it would be amazing. There's quite a lot of papers. I just picked some at random. Because there is so much literature on biomedical problems. If I'm looking at some interactions of a gene in some kind of biological pathway, I can get thousands of papers from a search engine. Wouldn't it be nice to just run something like this on all the papers and then say, OK, this gene in concept of breast cancer, what's the equivalent in pancreatic cancer? Well, we are not there yet, but we are trying. But now to some important questions. We have John Skeet here, who is very active on StackOverflow. He might have some opinions about this. So, is StackOverflow a meritocracy? Meaning, if you go on StackOverflow as a newbie and answer a question, is the score going to depend on the quality of the question, or do people look at, oh, that's some kind of new guy, let's not upvote that? So does your reputation affect how large a score you get for your answers? Oh, sorry. So I try to plot author reputation versus score they have for their answers. This is not a very nice plot. I can do it on log scale, which is much more informative. And this tells me that, for example, if your reputation is around 100, which would be here, then you probably won't get more than 10 points for your answer. I'm not sure what's the reason. If your reputation is 1,000, then you probably won't get more than 100 points. Well, but once you build up your reputation, then there is quite a lot of spread. But still, there is sort of an upper bound. So I decided to do some proper mathematical modeling and to try to run some regression analyses. So I have quite a lot of input data. I collected all sorts of data that I thought might be important in this and tried to predict what will be the score you get for your answer. So for each answer, I looked at if it was accepted, what score it got, what are the number of tags for a question original, how many answers were collected around that question, what was the number of comments on under the answer, how many people favorited the question, etc. So these are just external properties around questions and answers. So it doesn't tell me anything about the actual quality of what you wrote there. And I tried quite a lot of different methods. And the most predictive things were how many people favorited the question, how many people viewed the question, and if your answer was accepted. So that's amazing, because that really means that how good your answer was makes sense. So if people liked the question, and if people were interested in the question, if they looked at it a lot, and if your answer was good, well, that's amazing. But then I looked at some analytical plots about about how good it fit the data. Well, on average, I could only predict about 40% of the variance, which is not a lot. This is actually very bad, which probably means that what you actually wrote in your answer matters. And surprising, right? And then I was looking at some analytic plots. And this on the y-axis is basically how my predictions were different from the actual score. So you can see there's quite a lot of variance. And on the x-axis, there's something called leverage, which is this thing. It basically tells me how much leverage do some of the data points have against the entire data set, how much they can affect the entire prediction from my regression. So, for example, this is a high leverage situation here in the corner, because these points, yeah, they are important, but if this point moves, then the entire regression line moves. So that means that in this case, there is a group of points that have very high leverage, and they are sort of separated from the rest. So I was, oh, that's weird. That shouldn't happen. Well, then I looked at what the points correspond to, and they corresponded to John. So my conclusion from this is that the quality of your answer actually matters, unless you are John Skeet. So, yeah, that's my conclusion. Congratulations. So, just to conclude a bit, like from the technological side of things, I hope I showed you that F# is great for working with a lot of data, and you can do stuff quite easily without dealing with like, complicated stuff. For data science, you just want to put something together quickly, evaluate it, and get the result and move on. So type providers are wonderful for that. And from data science side of things, I want to stress, ask questions. Play with cool data sets, play with things that excite you, that you find interesting, because that's the best way how to learn. And a lot of these things, yeah, I use them on StackOverflow, but I can use them on my very complicated data sets as well. And because I know how it works on StackOverflow, I have more insight into how it works in my cancer data. So ask questions, and maybe move to Dominican Republic. Thank you. Any questions right now?
Why didn't you mention type providers?
Why didn't I mention type providers? Well, I didn't mention quite a lot of other type providers, because there's, for example, a SQL type provider, but because people use SQL mainly on weekdays, and this is a weekend, I didn't mention that. Yeah, question over there? Oh, the IDE that I used was Atom, actually. It's Atom. And the plugin that you should install is called Ionite. And the photo of the guy sitting on a hill on some touristy place in the mountains writing this was actually Chris writing Ionite. So install ionite.io. It's a great plugin for Atom and for VS Code. Any other questions? Yeah? Which library I used to visualize data on the world map? I was actually using Google Charts. And the only thing to use Google Charts, where do I have it? Here. It's in a library called Xplot, and you can just do chart.geo. And it has quite a lot of different charts, and the geo chart is basically just one of them. So I can, for example, look at R, and it basically connects to the Google API and creates the chart. And all it needs as an input is just basically a list of countries and numbers, and it visualizes it as a chart. And I didn't show you one cool thing about my JavaScript visualization, actually. This is my JavaScript visualization. And it runs, I wrote it in F#. It runs in JavaScript. And now I can look at, for example, if I look at, it's kind of hard to see. If you can see this, I can make it bigger. Nice. This is actually my F# code, because Fable produces source maps, and now I can debug it, even. I can, for example, here I'm loading the data, so I can set a breakpoint, and it stops on the breakpoint in my F# code, which is amazing. I don't have to deal with JavaScript. Well, this is probably not the best example for Fable, because I'm just basically calling D3 as a visualization library to visualize all the nodes, etc. But, well, you can do that. And if your program is doing some more complicated logic, then maybe it's good to be in some nice type-safe functional language rather than in JavaScript. Sorry. So, any other questions? Yeah, one question there.
Visualizations over time.
Have I done visualizations over time? Yes, I have. And surprisingly, I looked at the weekend ratio over time. And I don't have any plots here, but if you look at different technologies, usually it doesn't change that much over time. Well, it's only 8 years, basically. But what changes is if there is a new technology coming, there is quite a lot of variance in the data. And then it sort of stabilizes somewhere. Because at the beginning, like, some people are using it, so like only a few people, so it varies a lot. And then it sort of stabilizes at some point of some value. And that's fairly stable, actually. When John Skeet got the magic effect, I haven't. Maybe I should. So the next talk will be the development of John Skeet. All right. There are any other more questions? Well, I'm staying for the party, so find me, and I can show you your favorite technology on Stack Overflow, and if people actually like it or not. Thank you.